And we're going to continue with this chapter called The Pleasant Lake from The Grey King. Will and his aunt had a conversation about Bran and a little bit about Bran's mother. John Rowlands picked him up, and they heavily felt the power of the Grey King as they passed by the cottage where the sheep died. First Penn the dog, then Will, and even Rowlands remarked that something had gone on there. John Rowlands drove faster, pulling the tough little car around blind slate-walled turns. The road curved across the valley. Great new slopes rose on its eastern side, swooping up into the sky, bare and gray, treacherous with scree. Everywhere they loomed over the gentle green fields, dominant, menacing. And then, at last, there were signs of side roads and scattered gray slate roof houses, and before them, as Rowland slowed for a crossroads, Will saw the lake, Tal Yellin. His aunt had called it the loveliest lake in Wales, but lying dark there in the grey morning, it was more sinister than lovely. On its black, still surface not a ripple stirred. It filled the valley floor. Above it reared the first slopes of Cadair Idris, the mountain of the Grey King, and beyond, at the far end of the valley, a pass led through the hills away. Will felt toward the end of the world. He had himself under control now, but he could feel the tension quivering in his mind. The Grey King had felt his coming, and the awareness of his angry hostility was as clear as if it were shouted aloud. Will knew that it could not be long before one of the watchers, a peregrine curving high over the slopes, would catch sight of him. He did not know what would happen then. John Rowlands turned the Land Rover down a rough track away from the lake, and before long they came to a farm tucked beneath the lowest slopes of Cadair Idris. Will jumped out to open and close the gate, and as he trudged up into the farmland, he saw a small man in a flat cap come out of the house to greet the car. Dogs were barking. He could see one of them waiting a little way off where the farmer had left it. A sheepdog, a little smaller than Penn, but with exactly the same black coat and a splash of white under the chin. Rowlands broke off an animated Welsh conversation as Will came up to them. "Idris, this is a new helper I have, David Evans' nephew, Will, from England." "How do you do, Mr. Jones?" Will said. Idris Jones, Tabont, winked at him as they shook hands. He had enormous and rather prominent dark eyes that made him look disconcertingly like a bush baby. "How do you do, Will? I hear you have been having fun with our friend Cerridor Pritchard." "We all have," John Rowlands said grimly. He gave a whistle over his shoulder, and Penn leapt out of the car, glanced up as if seeking permission to leave, and trotted off to greet the other black dog. They circled one another amiably without barking. "Well, Ala there is his sister, believe it or not," Idris Jones said to Will. "Came from the same litter they did over Dinah's way." "That's a while ago, eh, John? Come along inside now. Megan has just made the tea." In the warm kitchen with stout, smiling Mrs. Jones, who was almost twice the size of her neat husband, the smell of frying bacon made Will ravenous. All over again, he filled himself happily with 2 fried eggs, thick slices of home-cured bacon, and hot, flat Welsh cakes, like miniature pancakes filled with currants. Mrs. Jones began instantly chattering away to Will Rowlands in a contented flow of Welsh, scarcely ever seeming to draw breath, or to give way to a phrase or two in her husband's light voice, or Rowland's deep rumble. Clearly she was enjoying relaying all the local gossip, and collecting any that might emanate from Clwyd. Will, full of bacon and well-being, had almost stopped paying attention when he saw John Rowlands listening, give a sudden start, and sit forward, taking his pipe out of his mouth. Rowlands said in English, "Up over the lake, did you say, Idris?" "That's right," Farmer Jones said dutifully, switching languages with a quick smile at Will. "Up on a ledge. I didn't have a chance to get too close, being in a hurry after my own sheep, but I'm almost sure it was a Pentrith ewe. Not dead very long, I think. The birds had not been at it enough. maybe a day or two. What interested me was the blood on the neck, quite old. It was very dark. Must have been on the fleece a lot longer than the sheep had been dead. And for a sheep that must have been already wounded, that slope was a hell of a funny place to go. Well, I'll show you later. Will and John Rowlands looked at one another. You think it's that sheep, Will said, the one that vanished? I think it may be, John Rowlands said. But later, when Idris Jones took them to see the ewe, he would not let Will come close enough to see. Not a nice sight, Backen, he said, looking doubtfully at Will and resettling the cap on his head. A sheep, when the ravens have been at her for a day or two, is a bit of a mess, and you're not accustomed to it. Wait here a minute or two, and we'll be straight back. All right, Will said, resigned. But as the two men went up the steep, slippery mountainside, he sat hastily down in a sudden fit of giddiness and knew that it certainly would not have been a good idea for him to have gone further on. They were on a slope rising above the lake, a broad, unprotected sweep of scree and poor grass broken by ledges and outcrops of granite. Further down the valley, the mountain was clothed in dark forest of spruce trees, but here the land was bare, inhospitable. The dead sheep lay on a ledge that seemed to Will totally inaccessible, high above his head. It jutted out of the mountain, and the pathetic white heap lying on it was not visible from where he sat now. Nor could he see John Rowlands and Idris Jones climbing higher with the two black dogs. 200 feet below lay the lake, its stillness broken only by one small dinghy moving lazily out from the small anglers' hotel that nestled beneath the mountains on the opposite side. Will could see no other sign of life anywhere on the rest of the lake, or on either side of the valley. The land seemed gentler now, with subtle color everywhere, for the sun was breaking out fitfully between scudding clouds. Then there was a scuffling and stumbling above him, and John Rowlands came down the steep slope, planting his heels firmly into the shale lying loose in the thin grass. Idris Jones and the dogs followed. Rowland's lined face was black. He said, "That is the same ewe, all right, Will. But how she could have got out of that cottage and up here is just beyond me. It makes no sense at all." He glanced over his shoulder at Idris Jones, who was shaking his bird-like head in distress. "Nor to Idris either. I have been telling him the story." "Oh," Will said sadly, without bothering now to dissemble. "It was not very complicated, really. The Milgwyn took her." He saw from the corner of his eye that Idris Jones Tybunt stood suddenly very still up on the slope, staring at him. Avoiding the farmer's eye, he sat there hugging his knees against his chest and looked up at John Rowlands, unguardedly for the first time, with the eyes not of a boy but of an old one. Time was growing short, and he was tired of pretense. "The king of the Milgwyn," he said, "the chief of the foxes of Brenin Lude. He is the biggest of them, and the most powerful, and his master has given him the way of doing many things. He is no more than a creature still, but he is not at all ordinary. For instance, he is now at this moment just exactly the color of Pen, so that it would be hard for any man who, with his own eyes, saw him attacking a sheep, not to think for certain that it was Pen he was seeing attack the sheep." John Rowlands was gazing at him, his dark eyes bright as polished stone. He said slowly, "And maybe before that he might have been just exactly the colour of cattle, so that also anyone might have thought—" "Yes," Will said, "they might." Rowlands shook his head abruptly, as if to cast a weight from it. "I think it is time we went down off this mountain, Idris boy," he said firmly, heaving Will to his feet. "Yes," said Idris Jones hastily. "Yes, yes." He followed them, looking totally bemused, as if he had just heard a sheep bark like a dog and were trying to find a way of believing what he had heard. The dogs trotted ahead of them, turning protectively now and then to make sure they followed. John Rowlands very soon released Will to walk alone, for single file was the only possible way down the winding steep path made by sheep and seldom used by men. Will was halfway down to the lake before he fell. and there we will pause.